The billionaire Peter Thiel regularly asks himself a question. It's a very provocative question. It's a question that doesn't make sense to the average person because the average person looks at time in a very linear manner. Linear meaning like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But when you start to understand that time is nonlinear and that time is relative and that time can actually be changed, then Peter Thiel's question actually makes a lot of sense. And it's something that you can easily apply. And so here's his question. He asks himself this question very regularly. How can I achieve my 10-year plan in the next 6 months? First off, you got to realize that time is actually a measure of distance. Time is a measure of distance traveled. And according to time relativity, the faster an object moves through space relative to something else, the slower that time is. And if you've ever seen the movie Interstellar, the Christopher Nolan movie, you understand what I'm talking about. So in that movie, Earth has become an unsafe place. And some astronauts jump through a wormhole, they go to a different galaxy, and they're looking at different planets to see if there's another planet that would be safe for humanity to inhabit. Well, one of the planets that they want to check out is orbiting a black hole, and because it's orbiting so fast, it's moving so fast relative to our Earth's orbit, that for every 1 hour those astronauts spend on that planet, 7 years pass by on Earth. So they've got to go to that planet, get in and get out quick because it's moving so fast through space that their time is so slow. Again, the faster an object moves through space, the slower time goes relative to something else. And in this case, it's moving thousands of times faster through space than our Earth. It travels the same amount of distance in 1 hour as our Earth travels in 7 years. And so time is really based on distance traveled. And according to time relativity, my time and your time are very different. Think about, for example, someone who can make $1 million in an hour versus someone who can make $1 million can't even make $1 million in a lifetime. Those are the same goal, but one person can achieve it in 1 hour, whereas one person spends more than a lifetime grinding it out. And so one person, it might have taken 60 years to travel the same distance when it comes to a single goal as one person could achieve in 1 hour. And so that one person was able to travel the same distance in an hour as the other person was able to travel in 60 years. And so when it comes to Peter Thiel's question, how can I achieve my 10-year plan in 6 months? What he's really asking himself is, he's saying right now, based on my current velocity, based on my current trajectory, based on my current strategy and my current pathway, it's going to take me approximately 10 years to get from where I am to where I want to go, because you're looking at time as a distance traveled. And he's asking himself, basically, how can I get onto a different planet or a different strategy or a different pathway? Or how can I find a wormhole that would get me to that same destination but in only 6 months? And of course, there are ways. There are ways. I don't know the way, but a lot of it has to do with how committed you are. Now, there are wormholes. There's ways to get to where you want to go fast, but it may require an enormous amount of courage. It would require you doing things radically different than how you're currently doing things. But you can travel the same distance in 6 months or in 10 years. It's kind of your choice. Now, if you're going to reduce the timeline of a 10-year goal down to 6 months, there's actually a great concept called Parkinson's Law. And basically what Parkinson's Law states, and it's an economic principle, is work fills the space of the amount of time you give it. And so if, for example, you give yourself 10 years to achieve a goal, it's going to take you 10 years to achieve the goal. If you give yourself 6 months to achieve the goal, you might break a few things, you might crack some eggs, but you could probably find a way to getting there. Psychological flexibility is an idea in psychology where you become very flexible and adaptive. It also connects with high hope. High hope versus low hope. High hope people are very flexible and adaptive, and they're willing to find new pathways to getting where they want to go. But in order to have high hope, you have to actually be highly committed to a specific result. Now, I actually wrote an entire book back in 2015 on this subject. So let me just tell you the story of this book to prove the point. I wrote this book with zero knowledge about the publishing world. I wrote this before I ever had a website, before I ever had a blog. I wrote it and I thought I could just go get a publisher. And so what I ended up doing after I had written this little book, which is all about how to essentially jump through wormholes, slipstream time hacking. It's a self-help book essentially based on time relativity and based on what we're talking about now. So I wrote the book and then I started calling literary agents and asking them, how do I get this book published? And they all told me the exact same thing. Well, how many email subscribers do you have? What's your website? And I said, I don't even have a website. I don't have any email subscribers, but this is a really good book. And they're like, you can't actually publish this book unless you have an audience. You have to have an audience. The publisher doesn't care about your book. They want to know how they're going to sell it. And the only way for them to sell it is through your audience. And I said, okay, well, what do I need to do to actually do it? And they said, well, you need probably 5,000 email subscribers. And I said, okay, I'll go get them. And they said, well, that's not going to be easy. It's going to take you like 3 to 5 years to achieve that goal if you're just starting from the bottom. And I thought, okay, that's based on their belief system. But I guarantee there's a way I could get there faster. And so I started doing research and looking at people who have millions of email subscribers, and I found ways to actually get hundreds of thousands of email subscribers. But in this case, within the next 6 months, I found a way to get 20,000 email subscribers. Within a year, I was able to have 100,000 email subscribers and ultimately get the book deal that I wanted, actually a very great book deal. But there are ways to getting there. Now, most people, they think it's going to take 3 to 5 years, whereas other people know that you can get there in 2 weeks. And so there are different perspectives, and there are also different strategies. There's a concept of fleas in a jar. And basically what the researchers did is they put a bunch of fleas in a jar. And the fleas could easily jump out of the jar. But what they did is they put a lid on top of that jar. And basically the fleas were jumping and hitting their heads at the top of the jar. And eventually they trained themselves to stop jumping so high. And then what happened is later on the researchers unscrewed the lid, and the fleas no longer had the ability to jump outside the jar because they had been trained to not jump so high. So if you want to achieve your 10-year plan in 6 months, you can. But it's going to require you to jump outside the jar. There's a great quote that says you can't read the label from within the jar. You've got to jump way out of the jar. You've got to start breaking down your assumptions of how things work. Why did you decide that this takes 10 years to achieve? And who are some people who achieve that result or 10x that result in far less time? You've got to go and rethink your view of the world. You've got to go and rethink your view of time. You've got to go find that wormhole. There are wormholes, but you've got to be willing to be adaptive and flexible, and you've got to be willing to essentially let go of the life you currently have. I recently did this. So I wrote a book called Personality Isn't Permanent. This is a book that I published with Penguin Random House, a specific imprint of Penguin Random House, and it's a very prestigious publisher. And they, for my second book with them, offered me a very terrible book deal. They offered me a very low book deal, but because I was slightly desperate at the time, I took the bad book deal. But then I started to understand a concept that Dan Sullivan actually calls always be the buyer. Dan Sullivan has a concept called always be the buyer, and what he means by that is that in every situation, you're either the buyer or the seller. The seller is someone who is trying to get something, and they're willing to bend over backwards to get it. In this case, I was the seller, not for this book, but for the next book. I was the seller because I was willing to give whatever the buyer was willing to take. My publisher was the buyer because they set the terms. They decided what they would buy and what they would reject. And once I learned to be the buyer, meaning I decided what I wanted and I stopped trying to sell myself, but instead I just bought what I wanted. I got what I wanted. I needed to find success for myself. I was able to reject that deal. And I was able to set the terms for a deal I wanted with a different publisher and was able to get a 4-book deal for over 10 times the amount of money. Now that's a nonlinear jump. That was me finding a new and different pathway, a very non-conventional pathway. Now, if you're willing to find a non-conventional pathway and if you're willing to try non-conventional methods, you can achieve 10-year plans in 6 months. You can find wormholes. You can find crazy situations if you're willing and if you're committed to finding those different pathways and if you're willing to go through those different pathways. The question is, are you committed to something specific? And if you're committed, are you willing to find an alternative pathway? In psychology, pathways thinking is a huge aspect of hope. It's a huge aspect of agency as well. If you believe you have agency and if you have hope and commitment towards a specific goal, then you're willing to find a pathway that will get you there effectively. Now, some pathways require a lot of courage. In fact, if you're going to take a 10-year plan and shrink it down to 6 months, the more direct path is going to probably require the most emotional purging. That's why psychological flexibility is so important. It may require asking certain people for help or trying things that just your former self would never do, or being willing to be directly bold, blunt, and honest, or rejecting great opportunities that your former self would have loved. My former self would have absolutely accepted that book deal, and actually they did accept the book deal, but my current self, as the buyer, rejected that, and I was able to find a situation that saved me 10 years of plodding along. And so the question is, are you committed to results, or are you just committed to your current strategy? If you're committed to your current strategy, or your current perspective or your current way of doing things, then it might take you a really long time. But if you're committed to a certain result, and if you're willing to find the most effective path to getting there, you can jump through wormholes. You can save 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And you can learn ways, you can learn how to create results that your former self never could have. I can make more money now in a month than my former self could have made in 10 years or 20 years. Like the Benjamin Hardy of 2010, the current version of me can make as much money in 4 weeks as it would have taken the 2010 Benjamin Hardy probably over 100 years at my old trajectory, because I was on another planet. Whatever planet you're on, you know, in terms of your trajectory, in terms of your state of being, in terms of your commitment, determines how fast you travel through space. So you can achieve 10-year goals in 6 months, but you've got to be a different person. You got to find new ways. You got to find your wormhole, and you've got to find that alternative pathway. The question is, are you willing to do that? My name is Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I hope you like this video. Please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe. Have an amazing day.